a headquarters for Wrigley's Juicy Fruit Gum. So that's why the Wrigley building is there. But its style of architecture is called Spanish Revival. And that's because the Wrigley building is actually modeled after a cathedral from Seville, Spain. Now you might be wondering, what is a Spanish cathedral doing here in Chicago? Well, in the early 1920s, architects in America are still kind of figuring out what their signature style was. They hadn't quite figured out what they thought was architecturally beautiful yet. So instead of coming up with that signature style, instead they kind of just copied things that they already knew were beautiful, which happened to be European-style cathedrals. So that's why you get cathedral-like buildings here in Chicago, as well as in different areas around the country. But on the outside of the Wrigley building, there are 250,000 terracotta tiles. And terracotta is a little bit more fragile than you might expect. So that means that you cannot power wash the Wrigley building, because you could break some of those tiles with that high pressure water. Which means that each and every one of those 250,000 tiles all need to be hand washed. Now, I'm very glad to be the person telling you that they need to be hand washed, and not the person responsible for washing each and every one of those 250,000 tiles. But now as we float under this bridge, you all are going to see the second tallest building here in Chicago. You probably already got a glimpse of it. It's directly in front of us, the Trump International Hotel and Tower. And here's where we're going to learn our first vocab word of the day, contextualism. Contextualism is when an architect creates a design that flatters whatever is around the building. So you can see there are 3 patios. Those are called setbacks. And those setbacks aren't built at arbitrary heights. They're built at the heights of neighboring buildings. So that first setback, where those people were waving, is the same height as the Wrigley building that we already talked about. The second setback is the same height as that sort of rocket ship shaped building that's across the river. And then that third and tallest setback is the same height as the black box building that was behind the tower that I can just now see kind of peeking out from behind. So that's contextualism, kind of tipping your cap to what's around you and working together to create a beautiful skyline. But now on the left side of the river, you can see a tiered building with a domed top to it. That's the Jewelers Building. The Jewelers Building was built in the late 1920s, and it's not going to surprise you to hear that a bunch of jewelers worked there. So these trucks filled with precious jewels would pull up in front of that building, and they would unload them onto the street. But you all might be aware, Chicago's a little famous for having some mob activities with people like Al Capone, and so the Jewelers Building was a pretty hot spot to get robbed. So what they did is they built a giant elevator that opened up on the street level where you could drive those trucks into that elevator and raise them to a different floor to unpack the jewels in safety. So that's what they did to keep from getting robbed. But now let's move on to 2 of our most photographed buildings here in Chicago, those twin corncob-shaped Marina City Towers on the right side of the river. So those towers were designed by a guy named Bertrand Goldberg in the 1960s. And he wanted for people to live in Chicago's downtown area, but Chicago wasn't really set up for residential living downtown in the 1960s. So he built those to be sort of a one-stop shop where you could live, work, and play without ever having to leave the building. So in the Marina City Towers, they had their own grocery store, their own shopping center, movie theater, and bowling alley. They have a place for you to valet park your car, and even a place where you could park your yacht. Which in the 1960s was a little gross, because this river was pretty polluted. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how polluted the Chicago River was throughout the tour, and what Chicago did to clean up the river. So if you look to your left, you'll see one of our first ways that we talk about it, the Riverwalk, where these people are hanging out. The Riverwalk has really changed Chicagoans' relationship to this river. It's what we like to call a positive loop. You clean up the river to create the Riverwalk, and then once people come down here, they care about that water quality and the ecosystem that's here. So that's how it's a positive loop. But it was a long time coming. The Riverwalk was originally proposed in 1909. I'm sorry, I just noticed that they were lifting up that bridge. That's very exciting. We don't get to see that very frequently. So take that in, because it doesn't happen very frequently at all. The Riverwalk was originally proposed in 1909 and wasn't finally born until 2003. So it's almost 100 years later. And you can see that they are doing some work on the bridge. And let's talk about these bridges. This style of bridge is called a Chicago-style bridge because they were built specifically for this river. And as you just saw, they do raise up in the middle. Now, they don't raise up very frequently though, only about 50 times a year. And that's generally during the spring and the fall when people are taking their sailboats from storage out to the lake, or in the fall when they're putting those sailboats back into storage. So it's very exciting that you got to see a bridge lift up, even if it's just a little bit. But the way that these bridges work is you can see that there are these kind of like house-looking things on each side of the bridge. Somebody used to be stationed there, and they would just wait around to raise up the bridge whenever boats were coming through. But now that we don't get so many of the boats coming through anymore that we need to raise up the bridges for, they are controlled by computers. And the way they actually work is under each side of these bridges, there is a giant cement block that is resting in a riverbank. So when they want to raise up the bridge, they'll lower that block into the riverbank, which raises it up. Works a little bit like a seesaw or a teeter-totter. And we are going to see one bridge a little bit later in the tour that is permanently stuck in its up position, because it's a bridge that we don't use anymore. But we'll talk about that one as we get a little bit closer to it. But now pay attention to the Wells Street Bridge directly in front of us. Look at its sort of old world, antique vibe with the handrails and the lamppost to it. That bridge was actually built in 2013, but it was built as an exact replica of the 91-year-old bridge that was here before. So it's a great example of how Chicago likes to respect its architectural heritage, because they could have put up a brand spanking new bridge here. Instead, they decided to make it that replica to show that continuity of what came before. But now I mentioned at the beginning of the tour this idea that architects in the early 1920s were figuring out their signature style. In the late 1920s, they found that style called Art Deco that you can see on your right with the Merchandise Mart. The Merchandise Mart is a great example of an Art Deco building. It's got those sort of vertical stripes that draw your eye up. It's got a telescoping tower up at the top. It's made of polished Indiana limestone, and then it's got those geometric designs all over it. So each generation tends to take their values and express them in the buildings that they create. So for the 1920s in Art Deco, it was all about sophistication and optimism and looking towards the future. So Art Deco is really kind of a futuristic design, even though it looks a little bit old-fashioned to us here today. But now, as we are passing under the Franklin Street Bridge, this is going to be an eyes up and cameras up situation, because we are entering into the trophy case of Chicago architecture. We're entering into an area called Wolf Point. Now, Wolf Point is where the three branches of the Chicago River meet. And you're going to get this beautiful view right about now. Now, the reason I call this the trophy case is because most of the buildings you're seeing were built within just the last 10 years, with one pretty notable exception. That curved mirrored glass building on your left, that's the Nuveen building. The Nuveen building is from the 1980s, but way ahead of its time. It still fits in with all these much newer buildings all around it. And it is consistently voted as one of Chicagoans' favorite buildings. And I think that's because Ferris Bueller's dad worked there in that 100% true Chicago documentary, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. But now I mentioned Wolf Point, the area we're in right now is where the three branches of the Chicago River meet. We just came up the main branch. We're going to turn to go up the north branch for just a little bit before we turn around and then head down the south branch to get some more great views of the city. But as we start to turn to go up the north branch, you all can already see the oldest building on the Chicago River. And it's that sort of pinkish colored building on the left side of the river with the windows and balconies to it. We've also got some construction going on over here too. So, but that building is called the Fulton House. It was built in 1898, and when it was originally built, it didn't have any of those windows or balconies to it. So it just looked like a giant pink box. And that's because the Fulton House was being used as a giant refrigerator. So you all might be aware, Chicago was a little famous for a long time for the Chicago stockyards, our meat packing industry on the south side of the city. Henry Ford had his assembly lines. The Chicago stockyards had their disassembly lines, where they would pack barges filled with meat into cold storage freezers like the Fulton House here before they would get shipped all throughout the world. Chicago was known as the hog butcher to the world. But then in the 1970s, that meatpacking industry goes away, and they convert the Fulton House into condos. But here's something gross about that building. When they were cutting through those 3-foot thick walls to create those windows and balconies, they discovered that the walls had been crammed full of matted horsehair and cork.
Yes.
Because that's what they had used for insulation back then. I told you it was gross. But now on the right side of the river, you can see that bridge I was talking about earlier, permanently stuck in that up position. Because again, it's a bridge that we don't use anymore. But with it, you get a glimpse of what one of those giant cement blocks looks like that's normally hidden in the riverbank. So you can see just how big that block needs to be in order to lift up the entirety of that bridge. But now on the left side of the river, on the other side of Fulton House, you can see this kind of triangle-shaped sloping building. Those buildings are called the River Cottages, and they were designed by a guy named Harry Weiss in 1988. And Harry Weiss was a big sailor, so he gave the River Cottages a sort of nautical vibe to them. He's got these triangles that look like sails, and those circular windows that look like portholes. But Harry Weiss was viewed as a little bit crazy for building the River Cottages. And not because of the design of them, but because he was building on the north branch of the Chicago River. And historically, the north branch had been the stinky, smelly, industrial part of the river. So who would ever want to live there? But Harry Weiss gets the last laugh, because we've done a lot of work to clean up the river, and a couple of those cottages have just recently sold for over $2 million. And now, you can rent kayaks on the north branch of the river, something that nobody thought you would ever want to be doing in the 1980s. Now, just as a heads up, I've been talking here for a little bit, so I'm actually going to jump off the mic for just a couple minutes as Captain Jeff performs a U-turn to get us going down the south branch of the river. But now's a great time, if you find your drink is a little bit empty or maybe your bladder is a little bit full, to head to the bar or the bathrooms downstairs. And I'll jump on the mic once we get a little closer to that Kinzie Street Bridge that we just passed under. And Wolf Point was sort of the original settlement of Chicago, which makes a lot of sense, right? If you're building a city on a river to kind of be a transportation hub, you want to give boats as many opportunities to go wherever they want to go as possible, so they can decide whether they want to head north, south, or back over to the lakes. But after it was that original settlement, most of the buildings in this area were factory buildings. And then not long after that, they were mostly office buildings. So there wasn't a real thriving nightlife that would happen in Wolf Point for a good chunk of Chicago's history. Because figure you would get off your factory or office job and head home to do whatever it is you wanted to do near where you lived. So when I first moved here a little over 10 years ago, there was no real reason for me to ever come to this area because I didn't work in any of the office buildings around here. But I also mentioned that some of these newer buildings were built within the last 10 years, and some of these buildings are condos, and with those condos come people that want stuff to do. So it's really revitalizing what was the original settlement of Chicago, which is very exciting. And Chicago loves Wolf Point. If you look over to your left, on the handrails right by the river, you can see they are decorated with a circle and a Y shape in the middle of it. That Y is referencing the Y of Wolf Point, because those three branches make that sort of Y shape. So hidden in this area are little Easter eggs of Ys kind of all over the place. And we're going to talk about another one. Directly in front of us on the right side of the river, there is a skyscraper that has a Y shape at its base. It looks a little bit like a pencil that's balancing on its tip. Now, there is a reason that it's built that way aside from just referencing Wolf Point. And so, that building only uses 20% of its lot space. That building's called 150 North Riverside. And the reason it only uses that 20% is because the back 2/3 of its lot are taken up by Amtrak Metra train lines that run under the plaza. So you can actually see those exhaust fans for when the train goes by. And then Chicago has a city ordinance that you need a 30-foot setback from the river for public access, so that people can walk by and enjoy the water. So 150 North Riverside is really pinched on that narrow little parcel of land, and they built that entire skyscraper on a 39-foot wide base. So that's just a little bit wider than the boat that we're on right now. So we've got an incredibly tall building with a narrow little base here in the Windy City. You all might already see a problem with that. Yeah, 150 North Riverside is likely to sway, or as architects call it, drift, more than most other buildings. But architects are smart. They figured out ways to deal with a drifting building. So, along the tour, we're going to talk about 3 ways that Chicago deals with drift. And one way is used by 150 North Riverside. They have what's called inertial slosh dampers. So in the top floor of that building, which you can't see, there are 160,000 gallons of water in 12 giant tanks. So as the wind blows that building in one direction, that water simultaneously sloshes in the opposite direction. And it brings the building to rest faster. So that's one way that Chicago deals with drift. We're going to be talking about 2 more ways a little bit later in the tour. But now, as we float under this bridge, on the left side of the river, you'll see these wavy metal panels that are right here at eye level behind that yellow cylinder that's sticking out of the water. Those panels are from a 1950s office building that stood here before the Bank of America building, which stands here now. But when they demolished that office building, they took off those panels and then put them up as decoration to show that continuity of what came before. Again, respecting that architectural heritage like we talked about with the Wells Street Bridge. But now we have the Bank of America building here, a very modern skyscraper, and with it you get to see what a different building does to deal with that 30-foot setback from the river. They've chosen to vault their 3rd floor on those giant tripod legs. So you get an entire office building while still having that spot for people to walk by and enjoy the river. But now I've got some exciting news for you all. The tickets that you all purchased to get on this boat came with a free ticket for a time machine. Ooh. So we're going to be traveling through time and seeing how architecture has changed over the generations. But whoa! Do you all feel that? We're in the 1920s now with this Art Deco building on your right. You can see those vertical stripes for the Roaring 20s. Until the 20s stopped roaring. 1929, you get the stock market crash, followed by the Great Depression, and then not long after that, World War II. So around the country, not just here in Chicago, office buildings weren't really built from about 1930 to about 1957. It's an almost 30-year gap in architecture. So when they reboot architecture in the late 50s, early 60s, they reboot it down to its core. They leapt into the modern age, and now so do we. Whoa! Into the 1960s. Groovy. With these 2 buildings that are on your right, these are called Black Box Modernism buildings. And you can see that they're pretty appropriately named because they look like giant black boxes. Figure the people that created this style of architecture, they were Depression-era children. So they wanted things cheap, they wanted things quick, they didn't want to sit around and argue about how many useless gargoyles were going to decorate the building. What they wanted were machines to work in. And so the father of this style of architecture was a guy by the name of Mies Van der Rohe. Now Mies Van der Rohe was a Chicago native by choice. not originally from the city, but spent a lot of his time here creating buildings as well as teaching architecture. And now he spends all of his time here because he is dead and buried here in Chicago. But Mies van Rohe has a quote that I think a lot of you all will be familiar with. Less is more, which you really see exemplified with these black box buildings. But how do you humanize what's a pretty sterile looking office building? Well, each of them have an extra large plaza around the base. And it's that plaza that gives space for people to gather, and those people give that warmth to what's otherwise a cold building. But now we're gonna move on into the 1970s. Whoa! With this white building here on your right. You can see in the 1970s, they're still making boxes. But it's a little softer now. It uses that white stone or concrete instead of that glass and steel. So that style of architecture is called the international style of architecture because it's kind of such a generic looking building. It can get picked up and put down in just about any city in the world, and it probably fit in well enough. Okay, we're doing our last jump into the 1980s, so feel free to make a stupid noise with me. Whoa! Oh, that was good, especially for how early it is. And on the right side of the river, you can see that curved mirrored glass building. That's from the 1980s. You can see they are out of the box. They didn't want square buildings anymore. They wanted a building that curves where the river curves. So we're seeing that contextualism again, only instead of nodding to other buildings, it's nodding to the river itself. So that's kind of the evolution of architecture. You get cathedral buildings in the early 20s, Art Deco in the late 20s, then black boxes, white boxes, and curved contextual buildings. But now we're back in 2022. Thank you all for taking that trip with me. And as we come under this bridge on the left side of the river, you're gonna see a building whose owners have put themselves on the map with it. And I mean that literally, because this is a giant "You Are Here" map of Chicago. We've got that red Lego piece sticking out. That's where that building sits on the Chicago River. You can see the Y of Wolf Point up at the top that we talked about a little bit earlier. And the grid pattern of streets overlaid on top. And then we're currently traveling down the south branch of the river right now. But if you're a movie buff, you might recognize this next building. It's this Art Deco building on your right. You might know that as Gotham Bank, from the 2008 Batman movie, The Dark Knight. So in that movie, the Joker crashes a school bus out of one of the windows, and then he escapes down Van Buren Street. Except the Joker escapes the wrong way down Van Buren Street. They reversed the flow of traffic because the filmmakers thought it was a better shot, getting the Joker heading towards the city rather than away from the city. But if you don't know this building as Gotham Bank, you might know it as our old main post office that was abandoned for quite a few years before an investor did a complete gut rehab on it and turned it into office space. But I mentioned at the beginning of the tour that we were going to be telling some stories about Chicago. So I've got 3 stories for you that I think are going to give you a great idea of how Chicago came to be what it is today. And our first story is the story of the Great Chicago Fire. So nod your head if you all have heard of the Great Chicago Fire. I see quite a few head nods out there. If you haven't heard about it, no worries. We're going to tell the story. But in order to tell it, we've got to separate out the tragic facts from the more comical fiction. And so here are the facts. In 1871, on October 8th at 9 p.m., a fire breaks out in Mrs. Katherine OLeary's farm that used to stand a few blocks to the right. Now that fire combines with a storm wind that creates horizontal flames that jump over the river multiple times. So people were running for their lives as the fire literally chased them through the city with these wooden buildings that were falling like dominoes behind them as they left. The fire burned from October 8th to October 10th, and 17,000 buildings burned down. 100,000 people were left without their home or any of their possessions, and 300 people died. Which, if you think about that, it could have been a lot worse. But there was a 3.5 square mile center of the city reduced to ash. Now those are the facts. The Fiction is where we get a little bit more playful. We know that the fire started near Mrs. Katherine OLeary's farm. Katherine OLeary was an Irish Catholic immigrant, so a Chicago native by choice, coming here to build her life here. We know she had a barn and a cow, and that the city was angry and looking for a scapegoat. And of all people, they chose a scape cow. They said that Katherine OLeary's cow intentionally kicked over a kerosene lantern that started the fire. Now, I don't know about you all, but I can say I've never seen a cow intentionally do just about anything. So to think that on purpose this cow kicked over a lantern is a little far-fetched. But the city of Chicago did publicly exonerate Katherine OLeary. 120 years later, in the 1990s, which was a little late for her. But that fire, it ended up being the worst thing to happen to Chicago, as well as sort of the best thing to happen to Chicago. Because the first city of Chicago burnt down, and the second city rose from its ashes. Maybe you've heard Chicago referred to as the second city before. That's one of the reasons we get that nickname. And those big urban fires, they tend to attract architects who come here and want to rebuild the city. And so those architects built the world's first 10-story steel-framed building, which you all might know as the first ever skyscraper. And once they did that, they were off to the races. So that's our first story. Our second story is going to take place a little bit after that, in 1893. So just 22 years after the fire had reduced the city to ash, Chicago was ready to host a World's Fair. 27 million people came from all over the world to visit that 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Half of those people were from outside of the country. Figure there was no O'Hare Airport they could fly into. They had to get here the old-fashioned way. So Chicago puts a guy in charge of the fairgrounds named Daniel Burnham. And Daniel Burnham wanted to create 220 temporary buildings that looked like they'd been imported from Venice or Rome or Paris and then painted white. So it was called the White City because all those buildings were painted white. And a ton of stuff debuted at that World's Fair that we're still familiar with today. Things like Wrigley's Juicy Fruit Gum, Cracker Jacks, cream of wheat, shredded wheat, dishwashers, the first ever Ferris wheel, which was designed by a bridge builder from Pittsburgh named George Ferris. And even Pabst won a blue ribbon for its beer that it still can't stop bragging about. Or even just the way that we use electricity today. Alternating current, developed by Nikola Tesla, debuted at that World's Fair. So it wasn't only this beautiful white kingdom, it was lit entirely by electric light in 1893. So all these people, they go back to New York and Boston and Paris and London, and they say that Chicago has become a world-class city. So that's our second story. Before we jump into our third and final story, I do want to give you a heads up. In just a second, you're going to feel our captain perform another U-turn where we're going to be going back up the south branch of the river and then past the dock and out towards the lake to give you all a great view of the city. But let's go ahead and jump into that third and final story, because this one takes place a little bit after that World's Fair in 1909. The city of Chicago approaches Daniel Burnham again, and they go, "Hey, Danny boy, you did such a great job on the fairgrounds. We want for you to redesign, replan, and reimagine this sort of chaotic industrial city of Chicago." And so Daniel Burnham was a part of a movement called the City Beautiful movement, which was really a philosophy, one that said that a beautiful city could impact the people that live there, make them more civilized or more dignified. So nod your head if you agree with that a beautiful city can impact the people that live there. What do you think? Yeah, I see a couple nods, but I think a lot of people that aren't so sure, a thumbs up. And if you're not so sure, that's fine. This is an idea from 1909, but it still resonates with a lot of us here today. So in order to make the city beautiful, Daniel Burnham created parks. We have 614 parks here in Chicago. A whopping 9% of our land space is park space that belongs to everyone. The lakefront is one giant 28-mile park. But in addition to all these parks, he also wanted to make big cultural attractions. Navy Pier was on that 1909 Burnham plan. He also created the country's first double-decker street, Upper and Lower Wacker, which was really forward-thinking because in 1909, cars were barely a thing. So to come up with something we're still using today, pretty impressive. But I will admit, he might not have been forward-thinking enough because old Daniel Burnham never saw GPS coming. And if you've ever been on Lower Wacker, you might already be aware that your GPS gets a little funky down there. But then he also formalized Chicago's grid pattern of streets and included something that East Coasters can get a little bit jealous of, 18-foot alleyways. So that our trash can go into our alleys and not on our front doorstep the way some East Coast cities just have to do. And the reason he was able to include those alleyways is because of the fire. The fire had given them a fresh start, a blank slate to rebuild the city. They learned a lot about city planning the first time they did it, and they put that into practice when they built the city for the second time. So you can see that these three stories, they really end up going together. You got a fire that destroyed a city, a fair that reanimated it, and then a plan that beautified it. And all of that was thanks to an Irish cow that was totally framed. But now I'm gonna take a real quick drink of water, and when I get back on the mic, we'll start. I think you would be right, because the same guy that did those corn cob shaped towers from earlier is also responsible for River City. But this is from the 1980s instead of the 1960s, so you can see how his style has sort of evolved since then. But what we're seeing of River City is just phase one of what was supposed to be a giant serpentine building with sky bridges connecting different parts of it. Unfortunately, we never got to see those other phases, but phase one still stands here really looking beautiful with all that exposed concrete to it. And when River City was built, it was the same idea, to be a one-stop shop to live, work, and play without ever having to leave the building. And you can see that under River City, just like with the Marina City Towers, they've got some places to park your boats. But those boats, they stay there all year round. And I know what you might be thinking. Chicago gets a little cold during the winter, and ice forming around boats isn't good for them. So what they do is they pipe air under the water to create bubbles that are going around those boats. And those bubbles keep ice crystals from forming. So that's how they keep those boats in tip-top condition over the long, cold Chicago winter. But now, let's talk about the queen of Chicago architecture. Directly in front of us, that sort of pinkish, octagonally shaped building with the barrels up at the top of it. We like to call that the queen because it looks a little bit like a queen chess piece. And so that's a building from the 1990s. In those barrels up at the top are a bunch of lights. Now in the 90s, those lights were so bright that they disrupted migrating birds that were flying through the city who thought that was the moon. So to this day, we actually lower those lights during bird migration season so we don't throw them off so much anymore. But what's more powerful than a queen? How about a goddess? So on the right side of the river, past this construction, coming into view, you are going to see a statue on top of an Art Deco building. That statue is a statue of the Roman goddess of agriculture, Ceres. That's where we get the word cereal from. It's also where we get the word cerveza from. But you might be wondering, what is the Roman goddess of agriculture doing on top of a building in Chicago? That's the Chicago Board of Trade building where they traded in agricultural futures. So that's why she's up there. But if you're looking at the Board of Trade building, and again, you think it looks a little bit familiar, again, I think you'd be right, because you all might know that building as Wayne Enterprises. Again, from that 2008 Batman movie. But now, we need to talk about the king of Chicago architecture, because we would not have a tour without talking about this building. Tall, dark, and handsome. It's that black building with the rabbit ears up at the top of it, or the antennas up at the top. That is the tallest building in Chicago. That is the Willis Tower, unless you are from Chicago, in which case you're calling it the Sears Tower. So like I said, the Sears Tower is the tallest building in Chicago. And when it was built in 1974, that was the tallest building in the world. And it kept that title until 1998. 24 years. It's a long time to hold on to that tallest building in the world title. The Sears Tower is 1,451 feet tall. So we've got another incredibly tall building here in the Windy City. Let's talk about that drift again. Because the Sears Tower, it does sway in heavy winds. It can sway up to 8 inches, and that's enough where you can feel it. Now the reason you don't want to be in a drifting building is because you can get a little seasick, a little nauseous in a moving building. But to help combat that, when they created the Sears Tower, they made it out of a bundle of columns. So if you looked at the Sears Tower from a bird's eye view, it would look like a 3x3 grid of 9 columns. Now think about it like a stick that you put in the ground. Pretty easy to blow that stick over. But if you take that stick in the ground and then surround it with 8 other sticks and bind all those sticks together, it becomes much harder to blow that over. So that's the idea behind bundling those columns. And the second way that we talk about drift here in Chicago, we're going to be talking about a third way a little bit later in the tour. But how do you measure a tall building like the Sears Tower? It goes from its lowest open air public entrance to the top of its roof, or spires if it has spires. But we saw those antennae up at the top earlier, and you'll see them again as we head under the bridge. Those antennae are temporary mechanical equipment, and they do not count in the height of the Sears Tower. But just those antennae are about the same height as those black box buildings that we talked about earlier. So imagine one of those buildings on top of the Sears Tower. That's how tall just those antennae are, 300 feet tall. But the current tallest building in the country is the One World Trade Center in New York City. It is the patriotic height of 1776. However, it's got a spire on it. A spire that people cannot go into. And the roof of the One World Trade Center is actually 83 feet shorter than the roof of our Sears Tower, which is what we'll call architectural cheating. But we'll go ahead and give it to New York anyway. 1776 is still very impressive for a skyscraper. But now you're about to see the Sears Tower is going to kind of tuck itself away. We have one last thing to talk about with it though, and that's the naming situation. Is it the Sears Tower? Is it the Willis Tower? What's going on? I will answer all those questions, but before we get to that, you all are going to get a great view of the Sears Tower from its base all the way up to the roof, including the sky deck, where people are going to be looking down on us as we look up at them. That's going to happen in between these two buildings at this bridge in front of us. So get your cameras ready because it is a quick glimpse as we float on by. And that view should be coming in right about now. If you look up, you can see those glass boxes. That's the sky deck where people are looking down on us, so feel free to give them a wave. Who knows if they can actually see us or not, but it's good to be neighborly. But now, let's talk about that naming situation. Because the Sears Tower was built for the Sears department store. But in the 1990s, they leave the building to go out to the suburbs. And then not long after that, the Willis Insurance brokerage firm ends up leasing a few floors of the building, as well as the naming rights to it. And nothing against the people at Willis. I'm sure they are fine, upstanding people, but us Chicagoans are a little bit nostalgic. Let's face it, a little bit stubborn. So we've all decided as a group that we are not going to call it the Willis Tower. We're going to keep calling it the Sears Tower. So the way I like to explain that to people is that you might see on a map, it's spelled W-I-L-L-I-S. But the way you pronounce that is Sears. Huh. But now let's talk about one of my favorite things about Chicago. One of the reasons I've been here for over 10 years, and that's the food. We have amazing food here in the city. I love the raising the roof to that. But we're famous for a lot of these food items too. Food like deep dish pizza. Now if you want my recommendation on where to get a good deep dish, and this is very polarizing depending on who you talk to in Chicago, I like Lou Malnati's. Lou Malnati's is where they'll put an entire hubcap of sausage on your pizza. We've also got the Italian beef sandwich. Roast beef simmered in its own juices, put that on a French roll, dunk the whole thing back in those juices, top it with some spicy jardinera or some sweet peppers, and it is sloppy and delicious. We've also got one of Oprah's favorite things, the Chicago mixed popcorn. Sweet caramel flavored popcorn with a salty cheese flavored popcorn. It sounds like it shouldn't go well together, but it really does. But my favorite of the Chicago foods has to be the Chicago style hot dog. And we're gonna be spending more time than we should talking about a hot dog because that's how much I love it. So the Chicago dog is said to have been dragged through the garden because of all of its toppings. But there is one topping that any Chicagoan will tell you does not belong on a Chicago dog. And if you know what it is, you can say it with me, ketchup. I am here to tell you, unfortunately, that is true. You should not put ketchup on a Chicago dog. You can put it on any other hot dog you want, but don't put it on a Chicago dog. And a lot of people give a lot of different reasons why. One is that it already has tomatoes on it, so then why does it need ketchup? Another goes back to the Chicago stockyards, that meat packing industry that we talked about a little bit earlier. It was thought that if a vendor put ketchup on your hot dog, they might be trying to cover up the taste of some bad meat. But my favorite reason for why you don't put ketchup on a Chicago dog goes back to how each ingredient makes it on the dog in the first place. And that goes back to the Maxwell Street Market. The Maxwell Street Market is an open-air public market that was created by the immigrants of Chicago as well as the black community that was living here. Those were the groups that weren't allowed to trade in the downtown business district, so they created their own place of commerce. And it is there that the Chicago dog was born. You've got an all-beef dog with a poppy seed bun that was made by and for Jewish immigrants who are looking to keep kosher. You've then got mustard. That comes from Germans who always put mustard on their sausages. Neon green relish comes from an old Irish recipe called piccalilli that has evolved over the generations. You've then got Greek immigrants who top a hot dog a lot like they do a gyro, with onions and tomatoes. A dill pickle spear from Eastern Europeans, sport peppers from Mexican immigrants, and then the only American thing on a Chicago dog, a shake of celery salt. And Aspen celery was grown in this area. So the Chicago hot dog is really this melting pot of all these immigrant cultures, all of these natives by choice that were coming to Chicago to build their lives here. So the reason that you don't put ketchup on a Chicago dog is because it covers up the taste of the American dream. And yes, that is the cheesiest line of my tour. Thank you all for listening to it. Oh, thank you. But now let's talk about some of the nicknames that Chicago gets. Nicknames like the Windy City. We get it for a couple reasons. One, it gets a little windy here. But then we also get it from that 1893 World's Fair that we talked about earlier. When they were still deciding where the fair was going to be, Chicago sent some politicians to Congress to campaign to get it here in Chicago. And those Congress people didn't really like our politicians so much. They called them those windbag blowhards from that windbag city. And in true Chicago fashion, we took that name and ran with it. But we also get the nickname the city that works, which we do. We are a very blue-collar town here. But we also work because we are a functional city. We have a great public transportation system. It's called the L because the train lines are elevated above street level. On the Lake Street Bridge in front of us, you can see how those train tracks are elevated above the street. And then a bunch of those trains make a loop in our downtown area. So that area is called the Loop. So if you ever hear anybody say, I'm taking the L to the Loop, what they're saying is I'm taking our public trains downtown. So that's some Chicago lingo for you while you're in the city. But now we are entering back into Wolf Point. Again, where those three branches meet. And remember, we're going to be going up the main branch of the river and we're going to blow past the dock and go out to the lake to give you all a great view of the city before we'll turn around and then head back to the dock that you all got on at. But as we come back up the main branch of the river, let's talk about the Merchandise Mart again. That big old building that's on the left side of the river. We talked about its Art Deco design on the way in. Now let's talk about how big it is, because that is a giant building. In the 1930s, that was the largest building in the world. Not the tallest, the largest. The Merchandise Mart has 73 football fields of floor space. They've got 7.5 miles of just hallways. In the 1930s, this building was so big, it had its own police station, its own fire station, and it even needed its own zip code. Just the facade of the Merchandise Mart is 2.5 acres. So what do we do with that 2.5 acre facade? Well, we project art onto it. It's called Art on the Mart. It happens after sundown, I think at like 9 or 9:30. You can check online for more specific times. But they use 34 projectors that project art onto every square inch of the Merchandise Mart, except the windows. They use lasers to figure out where the windows are, and they don't shine light in because they don't want to disrupt people that might be working late, which is very considerate. And actually, over here on your right, you can see in this black box are those 34 projectors that project up onto the Merchandise Mart. You can also see these green heads sitting outside of the Merchandise Mart. Those are the merchandising princes that shopped at the wholesale Merchandise Mart. Many of them owned their own department store, so Marshall Field is up there as well as Wanamaker. But I've heard if you climb up to those heads and push them back, a brick of candy pops out of the neck. It's a Pez dispenser joke for you. But now on the right side of the river, you can see these metal poles sticking out of the water. At the bottom of those poles, there's a bunch of plants growing up around them. The roots of those plants hang down into the water, and they give fish a safe place to spawn. So those areas are, no joke, called fish hotels, because it gives them that safe spot to go and have an intimate moment away from predators. Now, in the 1970s, there were only about 10 species of fish living in the Chicago River. But now, thanks to measures like the fish hotels, we have over 70 species of fish. So we're doing our part to bring back that ecosystem. Now, on the left side of the river, check out this red brick building with the clock tower up on it. In order to talk about that building, we need to talk about the street that's in front of it, LaSalle Street. Now, on that 1909 Burnham plan that we talked about earlier, they wanted to widen LaSalle Street, but that building was in the way. So, to make room for the street to get widened, they lopped off a big chunk of that building and then repaired up the facade to it. And they did such a great job repairing the facade, you can't really tell what happened. But I've got a key for you all to figure it out. Count the number of windows on each side of the clock tower. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bays of windows on the left, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bays of windows on the right. So this is a lopsided building. And really, isn't that why you take architecture tours like this in the first place? Is to hear about this stuff you wouldn't get if you're just walking by? I mean, look at these schmoes over here. They got no idea that's a lopsided building. But now, as we float under the Clark Street Bridge on the right side of the river, you're going to see a cute little building, number 55. We here at Shoreline Sightseeing love number 55. We love it so much that we have a nickname for it. We like to call number 55 the Danny Devito building. Aw is the correct response. You can see why. It's kind of short and squat in between these two tall towers. But that style of architecture for the Danny Devito building, it's called brutalism. You see it a lot with universities and government buildings. It's got those real deep inset windows with all that exposed concrete on the outside of it. But now, it looks like they've raised up the bridge even a little bit more. That's a great shot because, again, we don't get to see this very frequently. So it's very exciting to have you all be able to see the bridge get lifted up, especially while they're doing construction to it and everything. But as we float under the Dearborn Bridge, on the right side of the river, you can see a green building with a golden top to it that's shining in the sun. It's past that Morton Steakhouse. So that building is called the Carbide and Carbon Building. It was built during Prohibition, when alcohol was illegal here in the United States. And so a lot of people say that they built the Carbide and Carbon Building to look like a giant bottle of champagne. which it really kind of does, right? Yeah, it's got that green base and that thin gold top, and I think that gives you a great idea of how Chicagoans felt about Prohibition while it was going on, because if you know anything about Chicago history, you know that they were drinking their way through Prohibition. But now, let's talk about the Chicago River, because the Chicago River flows west away from Lake Michigan, but it didn't always used to. In fact, up until the late 1800s, the Chicago River always flowed east into the lake. But in the late 1800s, this river, like any river in an industrial city like Chicago, was being used as a giant sewer system. So all that sewage water was flowing into Lake Michigan and into Chicago's drinking water, which was leading to outbreaks of cholera and all kinds of other diseases. So instead of cleaning up the river the way any of us would do today, figure in the late 1800s, no EPA, no environmental consciousness. So instead, they decided to call in the Army Corps of Engineers, who spent years digging a 28-mile trench connecting this river to a river on the other side of a continental divide. They actually moved more earth digging that trench than when they made the Panama Canal. And so, when they connected those two river systems, it permanently reversed the flow of the Chicago River, taking all that sewage water and flushing it down to the Gulf of Mexico, which I know doesn't sound great. But we are no longer polluting the Chicago River the way they were in the late 1800s. Excuse me. Excuse me again. Had beans for lunch. Anyway. So, when they did that, we've got some kayakers in the way. That's why that's going on. But now, all that's getting flushed down to the Gulf of Mexico is that clean, pristine Lake Michigan water. So that's what's going on now. But we're coming back up on that first building that we started with, the Wrigley building, that Spanish Revival building. Look to the right of that, and you will see another Revival-style building. That is the Tribune Tower. So the Tribune Tower is also modeled after a European cathedral, this time from France. Look up to the top of it, and you can see those arches leaning away from the main part. Those arches are called flying buttresses. You see them a lot with French Gothic architecture, so that's called French Gothic Revival, because they're bringing back that style for the early 1920s. And so a lot of buildings in this area are based off of European cathedrals. This is sort of our unofficial cathedral district of Chicago, and butting its way into that cathedral district, we have an Apple store. Ooh. There are some interesting things about that Apple store, though. That glass is load-bearing glass. Look up to the roof of it. Looks a little bit like an iPad, or maybe a MacBook Air. It's a great example of how architects can advertise something without really advertising it. Also on the left side of the river, you can see our NBC Tower with the peacock up at the top of it. The NBC Tower is modeled after 30 Rockefeller Plaza in New York City. But 30 Rock is an Art Deco building. Ours is from the 80s. It can't be called Art Deco. Instead, it's called Echo Deco, because it echoes back that design. And now you all are going to get a brief glimpse of the Hancock Tower in between these two buildings right here. It's going to be a black trapezoid-shaped building in the distance with some rabbit ears or antennas up at the top of it. And there it is. Now, the Hancock Tower is the 5th tallest building here in Chicago. A lot of people say you should go to the Sears Tower during the day and head to the Hancock at night. And the reason for that is that they do have an observation deck where you can pay some money and get a great view of the city. Or for free, you could go up to a restaurant called the Signature Room that is just below that observation deck and get virtually the same view, using that money to buy yourself a fancy cocktail instead. In fact, the Signature Room is where my wife and I like to celebrate our anniversaries. And this is the saddest part of the tour, where you all find out that I am a married man. So sorry to break your hearts out there. Now, on the right side of the river, behind that James Hardy building, you can see a building with a bunch of oddly shaped balconies on it. Those balconies look like waves coming over the building. So that's called the Aqua Tower. But those balconies are actually built for a social function as well as just to look cool. Because if my neighbor walked out onto their balcony and I walked out onto mine, they are offset so that we can have a conversation with each other. So it shows how architecture can have these social reasons to be made as well as aesthetic reasons. But now, let's talk about this wavy blue building on the right side of the river. The one that looks like it jumped out of a Dr. Seuss book or something. That is the St. Regis Tower. Now the St. Regis Tower is the third tallest building here in Chicago. And it was designed by a native architect, Jeannie Gang. So she's actually from the Chicagoland area, and she's becoming a little bit of a celebrity here in Chicago. And that's because she is a certifiable genius, as in she won a MacArthur Genius Grant. She was also chosen over hundreds, if not thousands of other architects to do the $8.5 billion redesign of O'Hare Airport. And that's because she is that talented. But I mentioned that the St. Regis Tower was the third tallest building in Chicago. However, that is the tallest building in the world designed by a female-led architecture firm. So yeah, snaps all around, yeah. So we're very glad to have both the St. Regis as well as Jeannie Gang right here in our city. And in fact, there's so much to talk about with the St. Regis that we're going to talk about it again after we turn around and then head back this way when we go to the dock. But now, let's talk about this neighborhood over here on your left. This neighborhood is called Streeterville, and it has a fascinating history because it didn't used to exist. As in the land that it's on didn't exist. The shoreline for Lake Michigan was much further in until a guy by the name of Captain Streeter crashed his boat on the shore and left it there for years, letting silt build up around it. Now Captain Streeter then starts talking to some builder friends of his, and he goes, hey, if you got any landfill that you're looking to get rid of, just dump it by my boat. And they do. So some of these buildings are actually built on landfill from the Great Chicago Fire. But here's where Captain Streeter gets a little bit shady. He starts selling that land. Now the city didn't like that so much. They go, hey Captain Streeter, this is Chicago land, you can't sell it. And he goes, oh no, no, no. Here's a map of Chicago. This land is not a part of it. This is an independent district of the US called Streeterville. Now the city didn't like that either. Neither did the people that owned the shoreline. So they send cops and thugs to try and get him out of Streeterville. And he fights them off with buckshot. They then try and charge Captain Streeter with attempted murder, and he goes, oh no, no, no. I used buckshot that is non-lethal. And that argument gets him off. Now eventually, Streeterville became a part of Chicago. But Captain Streeter was such a huckster, it said that the mayor of Chicago went to his funeral to, quote, make sure he was really dead. So that's the fascinating history of Captain Streeter and Streeterville. But now, as we head under the Lakeshore Drive Bridge, on the left side of the river, you're going to see Navy Pier. Navy Pier is one of the great cultural attractions of the Midwest. If you find yourself at Navy Pier and are looking for stuff to do, there are a few things I'd like to suggest. One is the Ferris wheel. It really is pretty cool. Plus the cars aren't enclosed, so if you're scared of heights like I am, they're a little bit easier to go up into. And because the cars are enclosed, they are climate controlled. Heated during the winter, air can perform a U-turn. As he does that, he's going to give you all plenty of opportunities to take some pictures of or with the Chicago skyline. I'm going to hop off the mic during this time to let you all take those photos, but I'll jump back on when we get a little bit closer to that Lakeshore Drive Bridge that we passed under to go ahead and kind of keep going with the tour and then finish it up when we get to the dock. Okay, everybody, we're going to go ahead and start back up because we've got this beautiful view of Chicago in front of us. And we're going to go all the way back to before it existed. We're going back to the founding of Chicago. So, when Chicago was founded, all that was here was a lake, a river, and then a bunch of marshland. And so the founder of Chicago, or as I like to call him, the first ever Chicago native by choice, was a man by the name of Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. Now, du Sable was the son of a French privateer and a self-freed Haitian slave. So the father of Chicago was a French-speaking black man, something that not a lot of cities in the U.S. can say for themselves. But we can, and we love du Sable here in Chicago. We've got a ton of stuff named after him. Streets, bridges, parks, schools, as well as the Du Sable African American History Museum, which in a city full of amazing museums is really a pretty stellar one, so I'd recommend checking that out. But when he founded the city, he did it by creating a trading post. So he was just rowing down the Chicago River, he sees a spot where he's like, hey, that'd be a great spot for a trading post. And where that was, is actually basically where the Apple Store is now. But that trading post eventually became all of Chicago. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about Du Sable and that trading post, but I do want to interrupt this story to say that I promised you two things on this tour. One was we were going to talk about 3 different ways that Chicago deals with drift, and then the other was that we were going to talk about the St. Regis Tower again. And the St. Regis uses all 3 ways that we talk about drift on this tour. They've got those inertial slosh dampers in the top floor, that water that moves in the opposite direction that the wind blows. They're also made out of a bundle of columns, this time 4 instead of 9 like the Sears Tower. But this last one you can really see. Look up to the 82nd and 83rd floors and you will see that there are no windows there. They are just open to the elements. Those are what we call blow-through floors, where the wind can literally blow through the building. Now, the real estate part of architecture hates blow-through floors, and it's pretty easy to guess why, considering 2 floors in the St. Regis just recently sold for over $17 million. You can't sell those blow-through floors. But if you spent $17 million on your home and you got seasick every time the wind blew, you'd be pretty upset about it. So it's a good thing they have all those different ways that we deal with drift. But now, let's start talking about that trading post again, because Du Sable, he did get some help in opening up that trading post. He got some help from the original natives of Chicago, the indigenous tribe that was on this land, because we are on indigenous land right now. That tribe was called the Potawatomi tribe, and Du Sable married into the Potawatomi tribe. He actually married one of the chief's daughters. And even the word Chicago comes from a Potawatomi word, a Chicagoa, which translates to the smell of the vegetation that grew in this area. So New York is the Big Apple, and Chicago is the stinky onion. Yes, that is what Chicago translates to, the stinky onion. But what an onion it is. We've been peeling back the layers to this onion all along the tour here today, and I can pretty thankfully say that none of us cried while we were doing that, so that's good. But really, Chicago would not be here if it weren't for the Chicago River. In the mid-1800s, this was the shortest, busiest river in the world. It was known as the Golden Funnel because it connected the East Coast to the Mississippi River. So that's really why Chicago is here, because you could deliver goods all up the East Coast of the country, head in through the Great Lakes to restock here in Chicago, and then continue to deliver those goods down the interior of the country, down the Mississippi River. So barges and schooners used to come through pretty constantly. We don't get those boats so much anymore, but what we do get are semi-trailers and trains and planes. How many of you have maybe had a friend or yourself have had a layover in Chicago? That's how we say that transportation hub that we've been since our beginning. But now we are floating back towards the dock. So let's go ahead and handle some housekeeping stuff. At this point in time, I will ask for everybody to take a seat. The reason for that is as we come to dock, we can bump against the side of the dock, and falling over on a boat very quickly leads to falling overboard. We don't want that to happen, so everybody just take a seat, and then please keep your seats until the crew has put down the ramp and then has given you all the okay to go ahead and get up. I am going to be the first person off of the boat though, and that's so I can make sure that that gate is open for you. And then I'll be hanging out at the top of the stairs to take any sort of questions or feedback that you might have for me. And then you all can take any trash you have and take it with you. Throw it away in the trash can as you leave the boat or throw it away in a different trash can. We don't really care, just please don't leave it on the boat. And then you'll be able to see those photos taken of you on the way on the boat. Those are professional photos of the actual Chicago skyline, not a green screen like a bunch of other places do.